Welcome to Series 3 of our podcast, Conversations with Auditors. Today we're going to talk about the food and agri industry here in Ireland and globally. We'll also cover some key important topics for your year-end audit and your financial statement preparation. With me today is Tom McEvoy. Tom leads our Food and Agribusiness here in KPMG in Ireland. Tom, food is the foundation of our society, both globally and certainly here in Ireland. Board BA estimates that we export over 17 billion euros worth of food and beverage exports annually, and we employ more than 170,000 people in the industry in Ireland. While there certainly isn't a lot of opportunity for growth in the sector, global food security is certainly threatened by things like climate change, geopolitical stability, and health crises. We've seen the likes of the popular TV show Clarkson's Farm shine a light on some of the challenges faced by the industry, but also focus on some of the key benefits that the industry brings, like that key farm-to-fork experience. KPMG has also recently produced a global report on reimagining global food systems resilience, which promotes cross-sector food security collaboration and includes insights from over 200 global leaders. So Tom, how do we get our food today? How is the food supply chain working in today's modern world?
Thanks very much, Owen. I think, firstly, if we understand the whole supply chain in food production and distribution. Essentially, it starts with the primary producers, who we regard as farmers, fishermen, etc. They're producing some of the key ingredients into terms of all of the food systems that we know of. So beef farmers, dairy farmers, arable farmers, growing crops and potatoes, etc. in here in Ireland, fishermen and various agricultural bodies. They're really primary producers, and then it moves on to the processor stage, and that's really where they turn those raw ingredients into the foods that we know and consume every day. It goes on through then a whole cycle of distribution and wholesalers into retailers or the hospitality sector, and that's largely where the majority of us get our food, either from a retail outlet or through hospitality, etc. And it's various stages of that supply chain that could be potentially disrupted by various different events. When everything is in equilibrium, the food supply system works very, very well. We've built it up over hundreds, if not thousands of years in terms of that supply chain. And what you tend to get is sort of the core staples of each of our diets are produced locally because they're high volume and they need to be produced at as low a cost as possible. And that's why things like we have our main protein source, our main carbohydrate source, produced locally, etc. When it comes to more luxury items, they can effectively incur the cost of travelling food miles, as we call it, so that consumers are prepared to pay that little bit extra for those, and therefore they can still be at the right price point for people, for example, here in Ireland. But we're all consumers, okay? We all need food, we all have dietary requirements on a daily basis. So we are all part and parcel of the food supply chain. And as I said, when everything is in equilibrium, it's fine. But when you get one or two events that trigger a disruption, that's when the whole of the food supply chain can either grind to a halt, or you can get significant swings in terms of the value, in terms of the price that consumers are forced to pay, or that producers or someone else along the supply chain is incurring in terms of costs and therefore the net profit for them. And that then leads to things like where companies are going to invest, where people are going to invest. Can we continue to have farmers producing crops and proteins effectively on their land, or will they try and do something else? So that's one of the key challenges, is understanding what are the key disruptors that are facing each stage along the food supply chain, and that's where we are today.
Yeah. And you mentioned some disruptors there, Tom, so things like geopolitical tensions, tariffs, climate change. How can those impact the industry?
Yeah, and every one of those has a major potential impact. So for instance, we would have seen whenever the Ukraine war started, that Ukraine is one of the world's largest producer of fertilizer. So the price of fertilizer doubled more or less overnight. That had a significant impact in terms of the input costs for farmers, particularly here in Ireland and in Europe. And that then drove a lot of farmers to say, right, do I really have a profitable business here to continue what I'm doing? So that was one particular example. You mentioned climate, and we've seen, around the world in various different areas, whether it's a drought or whether it's a significant amount of rainfall that's leading to flooding, etc. That can have an impact in terms of how production actually continues all year round. We can have things like when the Middle East Suez Canal crisis happened. That put a significant blockage on supply chains and in terms of shipping being able to get through with produce, with food, etc. And each one of those immediately impacts in terms of both the costs that are incurred, but also the availability of food. And as we know, in any market dynamic, when there's a shortage of a particular product, the price usually goes up, and that's what happened with food and led to significant cost inflation. So any one of those, and there's just 3 examples, any one of those can have a significant impact in terms of availability, cost, profitability for any stage within the supply chain. Some of the other factors that have a major impact on supply chain, we've seen obviously during the pandemic, when significant disruption both to the supply chain but also to consumers' eating patterns as well and consumption patterns, that can have a major driver in terms of what is actually been demanded and therefore what is the pull-through requirement for the whole food supply chain. That can be a disruptor. We've also seen things like labour shortages. So the whole food industry does require a high volume of relatively low-paid workers. Generally speaking, once there's good migration, okay, that whole labour supply is in balance, and that's fine. When there's a disruption, when there's either immigration policies put through or there's a tightening of this labour supply, that's when either it can be shortages of particular types of product or a spike in the cost that's incurred in terms of the input costs for manufacturing some of those products. We're looking at the tariff regime and the impact on that, and it's still fairly uncertain, even though there's various trade deals being negotiated currently. But that can have an artificial impact in terms of a market and what consumers will actually be forced to pay for a particular product. We've seen where we don't grow many bananas here in Ireland. It's not really conducive to that. But we've got a good supply of bananas all year round because of long-standing supply chains from particular areas of the world where they're grown, good supply chain into Europe effectively, and we get all year round bananas, for instance, as one particular product type. If bananas are charged a tariff either coming into Europe or going out of certain parts into the US, example, the price point for bananas is so sensitive that could absolutely obliterate the market for them overnight. So that is a real challenge that is facing banana producers, and there's 2 or 3 major banana producers in the world, and that's something that they're facing as a major risk to their whole business. Okay, the imposition of tariffs. So these are just a few more of the global matters that can impact in terms of not only the food supply chain, but the demand, and that needs to be then considered by all of the food producers and all of the people and organisations on the various steps within the supply chain whenever they're making their decisions as to, do I further invest in a particular product or a particular market, or should I step back and look at something else?
And if we think about, we've heard a lot recently about weight loss drugs and the kind of significant impact they can have on people, losing weight. Can some of those items impact the food industry, or what kind of effect can they have?
Yeah, and that's a relatively new one. So the GLP drugs, or weight loss drugs as they're known, we've seen a significant ramp up in terms of the usage of those in certain markets. Okay, so what they do is they curb a person's appetite who's on those drugs. That has an impact in terms of the calorific intake that person is going to want or need on a daily basis. So if you take a market, for instance, like the US, okay, and we've seen where over the years we're at now about 30% of all food that's produced and supplied into the US market ends up as food waste. If there's a massive rollout of the GLP-1 drugs, weight loss drugs across that market in terms of fighting obesity, etc., the calorific intake, the requirement for that level of food is actually going to even further decrease. So producers are now making these investment decisions, when they look at investment decisions, they're questioning whether or not they still need the same level of produce, of food supplied into a market where potentially the market is shrinking and there's already an oversupply in that market. What it does drive, though, is it drives more nuanced food. So rather than supply a basic food commodity, producers are now trying to say, well, can we have an enhanced nutritional value? So you might have, let's say, your normal standard loaf of bread. It might be enriched with iron, it might be enriched with vitamins, it might be enriched with something else that combats a particular health concern. And that's really where the focus is now, rather than mass production of basic commodity foods, which are only achieving a certain price level. If food producers can look at enhancing the nutritional value and make it more health beneficial, that can actually drive value and drive a higher price point, which they can then go after in terms of it might be a reduced overall level of supply into a market, but there's a higher return for that product when they put it into that market. And that's some of the decisions that food companies around the world are making, not only for the US, but globally, as things like these weight loss drugs have been rolled out, and we're seeing a ramp up on those.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops in the future. If we think about investment in the food industry, then, is it attractive to investors, or are you seeing much capital flow into the industry?
We're seeing plenty of capital. Again, more in terms of, well, what can food do for the nutritional or the health benefit? And that's really the areas that people are looking at. Also more in terms of convenience. We're all very much time poor at the moment. So what was previously, everybody sat down as a family together and have a 3-course or a main meal once a day. That has now been replaced by food on the go, convenience. That's the key thing. But when you're doing convenience foods, you have to get the right nutritional value, the right health benefit from it. Otherwise, it just leads to problem issues like grazing and obesity, etc. So that's where the research has gone into, and where the money effectively is following in terms of investments across the food supply chain. We've also seen areas such as the whole area of food sustainability, and where food companies can demonstrate that they've got good green credentials, good ESG credentials, reduction in food miles, etc., which is a main issue, and ultimately are tackling food waste as an issue. That is also attracting investment very much so.
Very interesting. And a little closer to home then, Ireland has always had a world-class reputation for, producing food and exports, whether it be our, the gold bars of butter or our famous grass-fed beef. How's the industry playing out in Ireland at the moment, or how are things going?
Well, like everywhere, like globally, it's still got as many challenges, particularly at home. Farmers would be very aware of the current nitrates debate and this EU regulations that are coming down the track, which might outlaw or significantly reduce the current nitrates derogation that Irish farmers have, which allows them to spread natural slurry effectively on land as a fertiliser rather than go with a chemical fertiliser. That has a significant cost benefit for farmers in Ireland, and if that was taken away or significantly reduced, that could have a major price point in terms of, is it still economically viable for farmers to farm land, or should they be looking at doing something else with their land? And that's one of the key questions that farmers up and down the length and breadth of Ireland are facing at the moment. And that will be played out fairly shortly over the remainder second half of this year in terms of whether or not the EU regulation will be enforced here in Ireland. So that's one of the key challenges that we're facing here.
Okay. And then when it comes to the year-end audit or preparing your financial statements, what kind of things should people be thinking about in relation to this industry?
So like many of our other clients, we need to look at going concern considerations. We need to look at impairment considerations of particular assets and asset classes. Either short-term sort of working capital issues in terms of like net realisable value for inventory or trade receivables, but also more longer term issues in terms of, well, if I have a site, if I have a factory and it's a food production factory, am I still going to get the return on that if there's so many different challenges to the markets that I'm using or I'm supplying out of this particular site, etc. So we need to do the normal going concern considerations, looking out the 12-month window from when we're signing off financial statements. But we also need to look a little bit more longer term than that, medium to long term, in terms of what will the ultimate return be? How are the market dynamics changing? Will I even have a market for the product that I'm producing at the moment? If in 5 years' time there has been so much fundamental change to the supply chain, to how people are consuming the product, if they're consuming it at all, whether it's then no longer seen as a healthy product and therefore that the market dries up. So it's those sort of more medium to longer term considerations that really need to be factored in to the overall consideration of impairment and consideration of going concern. So they're the key areas that we should focus on as auditors in this forthcoming season.
Okay, a lot of things to think about there. Thank you, Tom. That was a really interesting insight into the food and agri sector here in Ireland. If you have any questions on the food and agri sector, feel free to reach out to Tom or myself here in KPMG in Ireland. And don't forget to check out our KPMG Global Report on reimagining global food systems resilience. There's some great questions for food and agri sector leaders in that report. Thank you and look forward to catching you next time.